The text message was simple. 7 words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Mason broke my arm, need help. I sent it to both my parents at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the emergency room waiting area with my left arm throbbing in ways I'd never experienced before. The response came back within minutes. Not concern, not panic, not even a phone call. Just a text from my mother. "Stop being dramatic, Riley. We're not falling for this again." I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Riley Henderson. I was 17 years old the day I learned that blood doesn't always run thicker than water, and sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones who refuse to see you drowning. The Henderson family looked perfect from the outside. We lived in a sprawling colonial house on Maple Ridge Drive in Westfield, Connecticut, complete with white picket fence and a 2-car garage. My mother, Patricia Henderson, was the kind of woman who hosted book clubs and organized charity drives, always impeccably dressed with her auburn hair styled to perfection. She had that Connecticut socialite polish that made other mothers feel slightly inadequate at school pickup. My father, David Henderson, was a successful insurance executive who commuted to Hartford every day in his silver BMW. He wore pressed suits, played golf on weekends, and had the kind of firm handshake that made business deals and parent-teacher conferences feel equally authoritative. To anyone looking in, we were the American dream incarnate. The cracks in our perfect facade began 3 years earlier when Dad married Patricia. I was 14, still raw from my biological mother's death in a car accident 2 years prior. Dad had met Patricia at a grief counseling group where she was dealing with her own loss. Her first husband had died of cancer, leaving her with her son, Mason. Mason Kellerman was everything I wasn't. At 15, he was already 6 feet tall, athletic, and possessed the kind of easy charm that made adults light up when he walked into a room. He played varsity football, got straight A's without seeming to try, and had inherited his mother's ability to say exactly what people wanted to hear. While I was still struggling with the loss of my mom and trying to figure out where I fit in this new family dynamic, Mason slid into our house like he'd always belonged there. The blending process was seamless for everyone except me. Patricia brought her expensive taste and social connections. Mason brought his trophies and college recruitment letters. I brought my grief, my awkwardness, and what they would later call my attention-seeking behavior. It started small. Mason would borrow my things without asking, my laptop for school projects, my headphones, even my clothes if they fit. When I complained, Patricia would smile that patient smile mothers reserve for difficult children and say, "Riley, we're a family now. Families share." Dad would nod along, seemingly grateful that his new wife was handling the teenage drama so he didn't have to. Mason was smart about it. He never took anything when adults were around to see. He'd wait until Patricia was at her yoga class or Dad was working late. Then he'd just walk into my room like he owned it, take whatever caught his eye, and walk out. When I protested, he'd shrug with that half smile and say, "What are you gonna do about it?" The first time I told my parents about Mason's behavior, they exchanged one of those looks that married couples share, the kind that says they've already discussed this privately. Patricia placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and explained that I was probably just having a hard time adjusting to having a brother. Dad suggested I try to be more understanding of Mason's position, noting that this transition was hard on everyone. But it wasn't hard on Mason. If anything, he seemed to thrive in our new family structure. He became the golden child Patricia had always wanted and the athletic son Dad had dreamed of having. Meanwhile, I became the problem that needed to be managed, the squeaky wheel that threatened their perfect family harmony. The stealing escalated to intimidation. Mason discovered that our parents' room was directly above the family room, while my bedroom was in the back corner of the house, practically soundproof. He started coming into my room late at night, not to take anything, but just to mess with me. He'd move my homework to different locations, change my alarm clock, or hide my school supplies. When I'd stumble downstairs the next morning, frazzled and unprepared, Patricia would cluck her tongue about my organizational skills. Riley needs to learn responsibility, she'd tell Dad over their morning coffee. Maybe we should consider taking away some privileges until she can keep track of her things. Mason would sit at the breakfast table, eating his cereal with perfect posture, occasionally glancing at me with that same infuriating smirk. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew I couldn't prove it. The psychological games were worse than the stealing. Mason had a gift for finding my insecurities and poking at them with surgical precision. He'd make comments about my weight, my grades, my lack of friends, always delivered with just enough plausible deniability that if I complained, it would sound like I was overreacting. Riley's having a hard time making friends at school, he'd mention casually at dinner. I try to include her with my group, but she gets so nervous around people. Patricia would look at me with concern and suggest maybe I should talk to the school counselor about social anxiety. Dad would nod thoughtfully and wonder aloud if I might benefit from some extracurricular activities to build confidence. And I'd sit there, knowing that Mason had never once tried to include me in anything, watching my parents buy into his performance completely.
School became my refuge, but even that was compromised when Mason started his senior year at the same high school. Suddenly, teachers who had liked me would mention how wonderful it was to have Mason's little sister in their class. They'd ask why I couldn't be more like him, why I couldn't apply myself the way he did. The comparisons were constant and crushing. Mason was student body vice president. I struggled to maintain a B average. Mason was dating the homecoming queen. I spent lunch periods in the library because I didn't have anyone to sit with. Mason was recruited by 3 different colleges for football. I couldn't even figure out what I wanted to study. At home, the dynamic became increasingly toxic. Patricia started treating me less like a daughter and more like an inconvenience. She'd plan family activities without consulting me, then act surprised when I felt excluded. She'd buy Mason new clothes for school, but suggest I could make do with what I had. She'd praise his achievements effusively while barely acknowledging my smaller victories. Dad seemed oblivious to the shift, or maybe he just chose not to see it. He was working longer hours, traveling more for business, and when he was home, he seemed content to let Patricia handle the family dynamics. On the rare occasions when I tried to talk to him about feeling left out, he'd give me a distracted pat on the shoulder and suggest I try harder to bond with my new family. The worst part was how alone I felt. I had no allies, no one who saw through Mason's act or questioned Patricia's favoritism. My biological mother's family lived across the country, and I only saw them once or twice a year. My few friends at school didn't know how to handle my family drama, and I was too embarrassed to explain the full extent of what was happening at home. Mason, meanwhile, was getting bolder. He'd started accidentally bumping into me in the hallways at school, hard enough to make me stumble. He'd slam doors just a little too forcefully when I was nearby. He'd turn the hot water off when I was in the shower, leaving me standing under freezing spray. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed as an accident, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. When I tried to document what was happening, writing down dates and incidents in a journal, Mason found it and showed it to Patricia. She called it concerning that I was keeping a fantasy journal about my stepbrother and suggested I might benefit from therapy. The therapist she found was a family friend who specialized in helping children adjust to blended families. During our sessions, she'd nod sympathetically while I tried to explain what was happening, then give me pamphlets about sibling rivalry and adjustment disorders. The gaslighting was so complete, so systematic, that I started to question my own perceptions. Maybe I was being dramatic. Maybe I was just having trouble adjusting. Maybe the problem really was me, and Mason was just a normal teenage boy trying to deal with his difficult stepsister. That self-doubt almost broke me. I became quieter, more withdrawn, more careful about when and how I spoke up about anything. I learned to accept the small cruelties and invasions as the price of keeping peace in our perfect family. I learned to smile and nod when Patricia praised Mason's latest achievement. I learned to pretend it didn't hurt when Dad missed my school events because he was at Mason's games. Most importantly, I learned that my voice didn't matter in the Henderson household. When I spoke up about problems, I became the problem. When I asked for help, I became needy. When I tried to set boundaries, it became difficult. By the time I turned 17, I had been worn down into a shadow of who I used to be. I was the family scapegoat, the difficult child, the one who couldn't just be grateful for the stable home and loving family she'd been given. I had accepted my role as the outsider, looking in on their perfect little trio. I had no idea that Mason was just getting started, or that the worst day of my life would finally be the day that everything started to change. The morning of February 14th started like any other Tuesday, with Patricia bustling around the kitchen making Mason's protein smoothie while Dad scrolled through emails on his phone. I grabbed a granola bar and my backpack, trying to slip out unnoticed, but Patricia's voice stopped me at the door. "Riley, don't forget you're supposed to clean the basement storage room this weekend. Mason needs space for his college preparation materials, and that area is just collecting your old junk." I turned around, confused. What college materials? And that's where I keep my art supplies and the pottery wheel Dad got me for Christmas. Mason looked up from his smoothie with feigned surprise. "Oh, didn't Mom tell you? Coach Williams wants me to create a highlight reel for recruiters, and I need somewhere to set up editing equipment. The basement has the best lighting in space." "She's not your mom," I said quietly, immediately regretting the words as Patricia's face hardened. "Excuse me?" Her voice carried that dangerous edge I'd learned to recognize. "Mason is part of this family, Riley. We make sacrifices for each other. Your art supplies can go in your bedroom closet." Dad finally looked up from his phone, sensing tension. "What's going on?" "Nothing major, just some reorganization to help Mason with his college applications. You know how important this year is for his future."
The dismissal was complete. My pottery wheel, the one thing I'd actually asked for Christmas, the one creative outlet that brought me peace, was being relocated to make room for Mason's video editing setup. I wanted to argue, to point out that Mason already had a perfectly good computer in his room, but I knew how it would go. I'd be labeled as selfish, unsupportive, unwilling to help my stepbrother succeed. "Fine," I mumbled, and escaped out the front door before anyone could see the tears starting to form. School provided its usual mixture of invisibility and low-level humiliation. In AP History, Mrs. Rodriguez praised Mason's essay on the Industrial Revolution while barely glancing at mine. In chemistry, Mr. Thompson paired me with Jake Morrison, who spent the entire lab period talking about how cool it was that Mason had gotten a scholarship offer from State University. "You must be so proud of your brother," Jake said while measuring sodium chloride. "My dad says he's the best quarterback the school's had in 10 years. "Stepbrother," I corrected automatically. "Whatever. Still pretty awesome to have someone like that in your family. Does he help you with homework and stuff?" I almost laughed. Mason helping me with anything was about as likely as Patricia admitting she played favorites. Not really. We're not that close. Jake looked genuinely puzzled. "That's weird. He seems so nice. My sister had him for a lab partner last semester and said he was super helpful." Of course he was. Mason's public persona was flawless, helpful, charming, the kind of teachers remembered fondly years later. It was only at home, away from witnesses, that his mask slipped. Lunch was spent in the art room, working on a charcoal drawing of trees in winter. Mrs. Chen, the art teacher, was one of the few adults who seemed to see me as an individual rather than Mason's lesser sibling. She'd been encouraging me to enter a regional art competition, but the deadline was approaching and I hadn't made much progress on my portfolio. "How's the piece coming along?" she asked, settling beside me at the easel. I gestured helplessly at the drawing.
It feels incomplete, like something's missing, but I can't figure out what. Mrs. Chen studied the sketch thoughtfully. Sometimes art reflects our emotional state. These trees look isolated, like they're waiting for something to change. She glanced at me with concern. Everything okay at home? The question caught me off guard. Teachers didn't usually ask about my personal life, especially not with such genuine worry. For a moment, I considered telling her everything about Mason's escalating behavior, about feeling invisible in my own family, about the constant walking on eggshells. But what could she do? Who would believe that the school's golden boy was tormenting his stepsister? Just the usual family stuff, I said instead, adjusting to having a stepbrother and all that. Mrs. Chen nodded, but didn't look convinced. You know my door is always open if you need someone to talk to. And Riley, don't give up on your art. You have real talent, regardless of what anyone else in your family might achieve. The kindness in her voice almost broke me. I managed a weak smile and promised to keep working on the portfolio, even though I wasn't sure where I'd store my supplies once Mason commandeered the basement. The afternoon brought AP English with Mr. Davidson, who had the unfortunate habit of calling on students randomly. When my name came up during the discussion of the Crucible, I stumbled through an analysis of how false accusations could destroy communities. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, talking about the danger of lies and manipulation while living it every day. Interesting perspective, Riley, Mr. Davidson said when I finished. You seem to have a personal understanding of how power dynamics can be weaponized through seemingly innocent means. Several students turned to look at me with newfound interest, and I felt my cheeks burn. Had I revealed too much? Was my situation that obvious to anyone paying attention? After class, I hurried to my locker, eager to escape the curious stares. That's when I found the note. It was written on school stationery in Mason's distinctive handwriting. R. Mom wants you to stop by Coach Williams's office after school to discuss your behavior issues with the family. Don't keep him waiting. M. My stomach dropped. Coach Williams was Mason's football coach, but he also served as the school's athletic director and had significant influence with the administration. Why would Patricia want me to meet with him? And why would she communicate through Mason instead of calling me directly? I pulled up my phone and scrolled through my messages. Nothing from Patricia, nothing from Dad, just the usual spam and a few notifications from social media apps I barely used. The whole thing felt wrong, but I had learned to not trust my instincts when it came to family communications. Maybe Patricia had tried to call and I had missed it. Maybe this was about my grades or my attitude or any number of things I might have done wrong without realizing it. Coach Williams's office was in the athletic building, a 10-minute walk from the main school. By the time I arrived, most of the after-school activities had ended, and the hallways were nearly empty. His door was closed, but I could see light underneath and hear muffled voices. I knocked hesitantly. "Come in," came the gruff reply. Coach Williams was a large man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades on football fields. He looked up from his desk with surprise when I entered. "Henderson? What are you doing here?" "My stepbrother said my mom, Patricia, wanted me to meet with you about behavior issues with the family." The words sounded ridiculous as soon as I said them.
Coach Williams frowned. "I haven't talked to your parents about anything, and I don't handle behavioral issues for non-athletes anyway. That would go through the guidance office." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Mason had sent me on a fool's errand, probably knowing exactly how confused and embarrassed I'd be when I showed up unannounced. It was such a small, petty cruelty, but it highlighted everything wrong with our family dynamic. He could manipulate me with a simple note, send me scrambling across campus on a lie, and there would be no consequences because I couldn't prove it was intentional. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "There must have been some miscommunication." Coach Williams looked at me with something that might have been pity. "You okay, kid? You look pretty shaken up." I wanted to explain, to tell him about the note and the pattern of lies and manipulation,
But how could I? Mason was his star player, the pride of the program. I was just some confused girl who'd wandered into his office based on false information. I'm fine, just mixed up about something. Sorry to bother you. I fled the office before he could ask any more questions, my face burning with humiliation. The walk back to the main building felt endless, and by the time I reached the student parking lot, most of the buses had left. I'd missed my ride home. The February air was bitter cold, and I hadn't dressed for a long walk. My art portfolio case felt impossibly heavy as I trudged down Elm Street toward our neighborhood, each step a reminder of how easily Mason could disrupt my day with minimal effort. It took 45 minutes to walk home, and by the time I reached Maple Ridge Drive, my fingers were numb and my nose was running. The house looked warm and inviting from the outside, with golden lights spilling from the windows and Patricia's car in the driveway next to Dad's BMW. I fumbled with my keys at the front door, my frozen fingers making the simple task nearly impossible. When I finally got inside, the warmth hit me like a wall, along with the smell of Patricia's homemade lasagna. "There you are," Patricia called from the kitchen. "You're late. Where have you been?" "I had to walk home. I missed the bus." Mason appeared in the doorway, still in his football practice gear. "Why did you miss the bus?" I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of guilt or amusement, but his expression was perfectly neutral. "I was at Coach Williams's office." "Really? What for?" The innocence in his voice was masterful. If I hadn't written the note myself, I might have believed he genuinely didn't know why I'd been there. "You tell me," I said quietly. Patricia looked between us with the beginning of annoyance. "What's going on? Riley, why were you bothering Coach Williams?" "I got a note saying you wanted me to meet with him about behavioral issues." "I never sent any such note. Honestly, Riley, Coach Williams has better things to do than deal with your imagination." Mason shrugged sympathetically. "Maybe someone was playing a prank. There are some real jerks at school who might think it's funny to mess with people." The casual way he deflected blame onto unnamed classmates was breathtaking. He had created the perfect crime. No evidence, no witnesses, just my word against his continued performance of confused innocence. "Let me see this note," Patricia demanded. I reached into my backpack, but of course it wasn't there. Mason had written it on school stationery, probably knowing I'd throw it away or lose it before I could use it as evidence. "I don't have it anymore." Patricia's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. "Riley, this is exactly the kind of behavior we've been worried about. Making up stories, imagining persecution, wasting other people's time with these fantasies." The word fantasies hit like a slap. She wasn't just dismissing this incident, she was pathologizing my entire experience of living in their house. "I'm not making anything up." "Sweetheart," Dad's voice came from behind me. I hadn't heard him come in from the garage. "Your mother and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to revisit the idea of counseling. These incidents are becoming more frequent, and we're concerned about your ability to distinguish between reality and your emotional reactions." The room felt like it was tilting. They weren't just dismissing my complaints anymore, they were actively questioning my mental health. Mason stood there, in his football uniform, the picture of athletic virtue, while they discussed my mental health like I wasn't even present. "I know what happened," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "Of course you do, honey, but sometimes our emotions can make us remember things differently than they actually happened." That night, lying in bed, with my art supplies piled in boxes around me, I stared at the ceiling and tried to process what was happening to my life. Mason hadn't just stolen my basement workspace. He had orchestrated an elaborate humiliation that reinforced my parents' narrative about my supposed behavioral problems. The worst part was how cleanly he executed it. There was no evidence, no way to prove what he had done. If I tried to explain the calculated cruelty of it, I'd sound paranoid. If I insisted on my version of events, I'd confirm their belief that I couldn't distinguish reality from my emotions. Mason had figured out the perfect strategy. He could torment me with impunity as long as he maintained his public image and my parents' trust. Every complaint I made would be filtered through their preconceptions about my difficult personality and his sterling character. I pulled my pillow over my head, trying to muffle the sound of Patricia praising Mason's academic achievements downstairs. They were probably discussing college applications, scholarship offers, all the bright future ahead of their golden boy. What I didn't know was that Mason had decided my quiet suffering wasn't enough anymore. The psychological games that had sustained him for 3 years were losing their appeal. He wanted something bigger, something that would establish his dominance once and for all.
The text message was simple. 7 words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Mason broke my arm, need help. I sent it to both my parents at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the emergency room waiting area with my left arm throbbing in ways I'd never experienced before. The response came back within minutes. Not concern, not panic, not even a phone call. Just a text from my mother. "Stop being dramatic, Riley. We're not falling for this again." I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Riley Henderson. I was 17 years old the day I learned that blood doesn't always run thicker than water, and sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones who refuse to see you drowning. The Henderson family looked perfect from the outside. We lived in a sprawling colonial house on Maple Ridge Drive in Westfield, Connecticut, complete with white picket fence and a 2-car garage. My mother, Patricia Henderson, was the kind of woman who hosted book clubs and organized charity drives, always impeccably dressed with her auburn hair styled to perfection. She had that Connecticut socialite polish that made other mothers feel slightly inadequate at school pickup. My father, David Henderson, was a successful insurance executive who commuted to Hartford every day in his silver BMW. He wore pressed suits, played golf on weekends, and had the kind of firm handshake that made business deals and parent-teacher conferences feel equally authoritative. To anyone looking in, we were the American dream incarnate. The cracks in our perfect facade began 3 years earlier when Dad married Patricia. I was 14, still raw from my biological mother's death in a car accident 2 years prior. Dad had met Patricia at a grief counseling group where she was dealing with her own loss. Her first husband had died of cancer, leaving her with her son, Mason. Mason Kellerman was everything I wasn't. At 15, he was already 6 feet tall, athletic, and possessed the kind of easy charm that made adults light up when he walked into a room. He played varsity football, got straight A's without seeming to try, and had inherited his mother's ability to say exactly what people wanted to hear. While I was still struggling with the loss of my mom and trying to figure out where I fit in this new family dynamic, Mason slid into our house like he'd always belonged there. The blending process was seamless for everyone except me. Patricia brought her expensive taste and social connections. Mason brought his trophies and college recruitment letters. I brought my grief, my awkwardness, and what they would later call my attention-seeking behavior. It started small. Mason would borrow my things without asking, my laptop for school projects, my headphones, even my clothes if they fit. When I complained, Patricia would smile that patient smile mothers reserve for difficult children and say, "Riley, we're a family now. Families share." Dad would nod along, seemingly grateful that his new wife was handling the teenage drama so he didn't have to. Mason was smart about it. He never took anything when adults were around to see. He'd wait until Patricia was at her yoga class or Dad was working late. Then he'd just walk into my room like he owned it, take whatever caught his eye, and walk out. When I protested, he'd shrug with that half smile and say, "What are you gonna do about it?" The first time I told my parents about Mason's behavior, they exchanged one of those looks that married couples share, the kind that says they've already discussed this privately. Patricia placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and explained that I was probably just having a hard time adjusting to having a brother. Dad suggested I try to be more understanding of Mason's position, noting that this transition was hard on everyone.
But it wasn't hard on Mason. If anything, he seemed to thrive in our new family structure. He became the golden child Patricia had always wanted and the athletic son Dad had dreamed of having. Meanwhile, I became the problem that needed to be managed, the squeaky wheel that threatened their perfect family harmony. The stealing escalated to intimidation. Mason discovered that our parents' room was directly above the family room, while my bedroom was in the back corner of the house, practically soundproof. He started coming into my room late at night, not to take anything, but just to mess with me. He'd move my homework to different locations, change my alarm clock, or hide my school supplies. When I'd stumble downstairs the next morning, frazzled and unprepared, Patricia would cluck her tongue about my organizational skills. Riley needs to learn responsibility, she'd tell Dad over their morning coffee. Maybe we should consider taking away some privileges until she can keep track of her things. Mason would sit at the breakfast table, eating his cereal with perfect posture, occasionally glancing at me with that same infuriating smirk. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew I couldn't prove it. The psychological games were worse than the stealing. Mason had a gift for finding my insecurities and poking at them with surgical precision. He'd make comments about my weight, my grades, my lack of friends, always delivered with just enough plausible deniability that if I complained, it would sound like I was overreacting. Riley's having a hard time making friends at school, he'd mention casually at dinner. I try to include her with my group, but she gets so nervous around people. Patricia would look at me with concern and suggest maybe I should talk to the school counselor about social anxiety. Dad would nod thoughtfully and wonder aloud if I might benefit from some extracurricular activities to build confidence. And I'd sit there, knowing that Mason had never once tried to include me in anything, watching my parents buy into his performance completely.
I stayed late to photograph my portfolio pieces, wanting to submit my application that evening before I lost my nerve. By the time I left school, the sun was setting and the parking lot was nearly empty. I walked home through the gathering dusk, my portfolio case feeling lighter than it had in weeks. The house was dark when I arrived, which was unusual for a Thursday evening. Patricia's car was gone, and Dad typically didn't get home from work until after 6. Only Mason's Jeep sat in the driveway, which meant he was home alone. I let myself in through the front door, calling out a greeting as I hung my jacket in the closet. No response. I assumed Mason was in the basement with his headphones on, lost in whatever video project he was working on. I headed upstairs to my room, eager to scan my portfolio pieces and submit my competition application online. That's when I heard the sound of movement from my parents' bedroom. Thinking Dad might have come home early with a headache or something, I walked down the hallway to check on him. The door to their room was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see Mason standing at Patricia's jewelry box on her dresser. He had something small and glittering in his hand, a ring or earrings, I couldn't tell which, and he was examining it carefully before slipping it into his pocket. I froze in the hallway, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Mason was stealing from Patricia, the woman who treated him like her biological son, who praised him constantly and defended him against any criticism. The golden boy, the perfect stepson, was a thief. For a long moment, I stood there paralyzed by shock and a kind of vindictive satisfaction. Finally, I had evidence of Mason's true nature. Finally, I had something concrete to show Patricia and Dad. Proof that their precious stepson wasn't the saint they believed him to be. But even as I reached for my phone to take a picture, I realized the futility of the gesture. Mason would hear the camera sound and know I'd seen him. He'd have time to put the jewelry back, to come up with some explanation, to turn the situation around so that I became the one in trouble for spying on him. Instead, I backed away quietly and retreated to my room, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. I had witnessed something that could change everything, but I needed to be smart about how I used this information. I needed to think strategically, the way Mason always did. I spent the next hour researching Patricia's jewelry online, trying to identify what Mason had taken.
From what I could remember, it looked like a small diamond pendant that Patricia had inherited from her grandmother, valuable both sentimentally and monetarily. If I could prove Mason had stolen it, even Patricia's maternal blindness would have to acknowledge his true nature. But as the evening wore on, and I heard the familiar sounds of family life resuming, Patricia returning from her book club, Dad coming home from work, the cheerful chatter of dinner conversation downstairs, I began to doubt my plan. Who would believe me? I'd been crying wolf about Mason's behavior for 3 years, building a reputation as a difficult, attention-seeking teenager who made up stories about her poor, innocent stepbrother. Even if I could prove the theft, Mason would find a way to explain it. Maybe he was cleaning the jewelry for Patricia as a surprise. Maybe he was borrowing it for some romantic gesture with Stephanie. Maybe he was taking it to be repaired. He always had explanations, always had reasons that made him look thoughtful and caring while making me look suspicious and vindictive. The next morning, I watched Patricia get ready for work, waiting to see if she noticed the missing pendant. She stood at her jewelry box for several minutes, selecting earrings and a bracelet, but showed no signs of distress or confusion. Either the pendant wasn't as important as I thought it was, or she simply hadn't noticed it was gone yet. At breakfast, Mason was his usual charming self, asking Dad about a business trip and complimenting Patricia on her new blouse. He met my eyes once across the table and gave me a small, knowing smile that made my blood run cold. He knew that I'd seen him, and he wasn't worried about it in the slightest. That's when I realized how completely he had outmaneuvered me. Even with evidence of his criminal behavior, I was powerless to act on it. He had spent 3 years systematically destroying my credibility, painting me as unstable and untrustworthy, creating a narrative where any accusation I made would be dismissed as another fantasy. He had turned my own family into his accomplices, convinced them that I was the problem, the liar, the one who couldn't be trusted. And now, watching him butter his toast with perfect composure while stolen jewelry sat in his pocket, I understood that he had been building towards something much bigger than petty theft. Mason wasn't just stealing Patricia's pendant, he was stealing my entire life, piece by piece, and no one would believe me when the final blow came. The art competition deadline passed that night while I sat in my room, paralyzed by the knowledge that even my small moment of potential triumph had been overshadowed by Mason's latest crime. I never submitted my portfolio. I never told Mrs. Chen why I'd changed my mind. I just sat there in the dark, waiting for whatever Mason had planned next, knowing that when it came, I would face it completely alone. The third week of April brought an unseasonable heat wave that made everyone at Westfield High irritable and restless. The aging air conditioning system struggled against temperatures in the mid-80s, creating a stuffy atmosphere that seemed to amplify every tension and conflict. It was the kind of weather that made small disagreements feel like major confrontations, and major confrontations feel inevitable. I should have recognized the warning signs. Mason had been unusually quiet for several days, moving through the house with a focused intensity that I'd learned to associate with his more elaborate schemes. He spent hours in the basement with his door locked, supposedly working on college preparation materials, but the sounds that drifted upstairs suggested something more complex than simple video editing.
Patricia had been increasingly stressed about the upcoming graduation ceremonies and college transition plans. She'd thrown herself into party planning with the manic energy of someone trying to control every possible variable. The kitchen counter was covered with catering menus, decoration samples, and guest lists that seemed to grow longer each day. Dad had retreated even further into his work, staying late at the office to avoid the domestic chaos. In this atmosphere of mounting tension, I tried to maintain my usual invisibility. I kept my head down at school, avoiding unnecessary interactions with Mason's friends and teachers who might report back to him. I spent my lunch periods in the library, working on assignments that no longer seemed to matter much.
My grades had stabilized at a mediocre level that disappointed Patricia, but didn't quite warrant intervention. The theft of Patricia's pendant remained a secret between Mason and me, a loaded weapon that neither of us had chosen to deploy. I'd watched him carefully over the past month, looking for signs that he'd returned the jewelry or that Patricia had noticed its absence, but the household routine continued unchanged. The pendant's disappearance seemed to exist in a parallel reality that only Mason and I inhabited. Tuesday afternoon brought an unexpected opportunity. Patricia had driven to Hartford for a meeting with her financial advisor, something about college fund transfers and investment portfolios. Dad was traveling for work, attending a conference in Boston that would keep him away until Thursday. For the first time in months, Mason and I would be alone in the house together for an extended period. I considered staying after school for extra help sessions or finding excuses to visit friends I barely had, but something stubborn in me rebelled against being driven from my own home. I was tired of rearranging my life around Mason's presence, tired of tiptoeing through my own house like an unwelcome guest. If he wanted to avoid me, he could be the one to make alternative plans. The bus ride home was unusually quiet, with many students staying late for spring sports practices or club meetings. I sat near the front, watching the familiar neighborhoods roll past, trying to summon the courage for whatever confrontation might be waiting. Mrs. Chen had asked about my portfolio again that day, wondering if I'd changed my mind about the competition. Her disappointed expression when I deflected her questions had made me feel like even more of a failure. The house was silent when I arrived, Mason's Jeep absent from the driveway. I felt a wave of relief mixed with disappointment. Part of me had been preparing for some kind of showdown, and his absence left me feeling anticlimactic and deflated. I let myself in through the front door and headed straight for the kitchen, suddenly ravenous in the way that emotional stress can make you feel. I was halfway through making a sandwich when I heard the basement door creak open. My hands froze on the bread loaf as Mason's footsteps echoed up the wooden stairs. He'd been home all along, working in his underground lair while I assumed the house was empty. "Hey, sis," he said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with that familiar half-smile that never reached his eyes. "Didn't hear you come in." "Your car's not in the driveway." Stephanie borrowed it, had to take her little sister to dance practice. He moved to the refrigerator and pulled out a sports drink, his movements casual and unthreatening. We're all alone for once. No parents, no distractions, just family. Something in his tone made my skin crawl. The word family in Mason's mouth sounded like a threat, laden with implications I didn't want to explore. "I have homework," I said, abandoning my half-made sandwich and heading for the stairs. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk." His voice stopped me at the kitchen doorway. "Clear the air about some things. It's been pretty tense around here lately." I turned to face him, searching his expression for clues about his intentions. Mason looked relaxed, almost friendly, but I learned not to trust his public personas. "What things?" "Come on, Riley. We both know you've been watching me, looking for reasons to get me in trouble, like last month when you were lurking outside Mom and Dad's room." The casual way he acknowledged my discovery of his theft sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't denying it or trying to explain it away. He was admitting it with the confidence of someone who knew there would be no consequences. "I saw you steal Patricia's pendant." "Did you? Or did you see me returning something I'd borrowed to have cleaned as a surprise?" He took a long drink from his sports bottle, watching me over the rim. "Because that's what really happened. I had the clasp repaired at Morrison's Jewelry downtown. Got the receipt, if you want to see it." "Of course he did! Mason always had receipts, always had explanations, always had a paper trail that supported whatever narrative he chose to construct. The fact that he had a month to fabricate evidence didn't diminish his confidence in the slightest. Patricia didn't ask you to have it repaired. Patricia doesn't know about it yet. It's going to be a Mother's Day surprise, along with a nice card about how grateful I am for everything she's done for me." His smile widened slightly. The manipulation was breathtaking in its completeness. He turned a theft into a gift, theft into thoughtfulness, and positioned himself as the caring son while making me look like a suspicious, ungrateful daughter. Even if I told Patricia the pendant now, she'd see his surprise as evidence of his good character and my accusations as proof of my disturbed state of mind. "You're sick," I said quietly.
I'm strategic. There's a difference. Mason finished his drink and tossed the bottle into the recycling bin with practiced aim. But since we're being honest with each other, there's something else we need to discuss. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, smoothing it out on the kitchen counter. Even from across the room, I could see it was a printout of an email, my email, addressed to the regional art competition coordinators. Did you know that your laptop automatically backs up to the family cloud drive? Dad set it up that way for security reasons when he bought your computer. Very responsible of him. Mason's tone was conversational, almost educational. Anyway, I was doing some routine file management and came across this draft email where you're begging the competition judges to extend the deadline because of family circumstances that have prevented you from submitting your portfolio. My stomach dropped. I'd written that email in a moment of desperate frustration, pouring out my feelings about the hostile home environment and how it had affected my ability to focus on my art. I'd never sent it. The complaints had seemed too pathetic, too much like making excuses. But apparently Mason had found it in my drafts folder. "Pretty embarrassing stuff," he continued, scanning the printout with theatrical interest. "All this drama about feeling unsupported and misunderstood really paints Mom and Dad in a negative light, don't you think? You had no right to read my private emails. Technically, it's Dad's computer and Dad's cloud storage, so I'd argue I had every right. But that's beside the point." He folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. "The point is that this email shows a very disturbed pattern of thinking. Someone might read this and think you're having some kind of mental health crisis." The implicit threat was unmistakable. Mason had ammunition that could be used to paint me as unstable, ungrateful, and delusional. Combined with 3 years of carefully documented behavioral incidents, this email could be the final piece of evidence needed to convince my parents that I needed serious psychological intervention. "What do you want?" "I want you to stop being a problem." His friendly demeanor evaporated, replaced by something cold and calculating. "I want you to stop lurking around, stop making accusations, stop trying to undermine my relationship with our parents. I want you to accept your place in this family and stop fighting against the natural order." Which is what, exactly? You're the broken one, Riley. The difficult child, who can't adjust to having a loving family. Mom and Dad have been incredibly patient with your issues, but their patience isn't infinite. Especially not when I'm heading off to college and they want to focus on positive things. Mason moved closer as he spoke, his physical presence becoming more intimidating. He was several inches taller than me and had the build of a varsity athlete. I'd never felt threatened by his size before, but something in his posture suggested that the implicit threat of violence had always been there, waiting to be deployed. "I'm not the broken one, aren't you?" Let's see. Social isolation, academic underachievement, paranoid delusions about your loving stepbrother, inability to form healthy relationships with your parents. Sounds pretty broken to me. He was close enough now that I could smell his cologne and see the cold calculation in his eyes. This wasn't anger or emotion driving his behavior. It was pure strategic thinking, a chess player moving pieces into position for checkmate. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You're going to go upstairs, pack a bag, and leave. Tell Mom and Dad you need some time to think, that you're staying with a friend for a few days. Give them some space to process how difficult this transition has been for everyone." "I'm not leaving my own house." "Yes, you are, because if you don't, I'm going to show them that email along with some other concerning materials I've collected. And then we're going to have a very serious family conversation about your mental state and what kind of intervention might be necessary." The word intervention hung in the air like a sword. I could picture the scene. Mason presenting his carefully curated evidence, Patricia's concerned face, Dad's disappointed sighs, the inevitable conclusion that I needed professional help. They'd probably frame it as love, as concern for my well-being, but the result would be the same. I'd be removed from the house, possibly committed for evaluation, certainly stripped of any remaining credibility or autonomy. You can't make me leave. I don't have to make you do anything, Riley. I just have to let you make your own choices and live with the consequences. Something in his tone suggested that the consequences he had in mind went beyond social embarrassment or family conflict. For the first time in our 3-year war of attrition, I felt genuinely afraid of what Mason might be capable of. "I think you should go pack that bag now," he said, stepping back to give me room to move toward the stairs. "Before Mom gets home, we have to have that uncomfortable conversation about your stability." I looked at his face, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation, but found only cold determination. Mason had been building toward this moment for 3 years, systematically destroying my credibility and isolating me from any source of support. Now he was ready to deliver the final blow, to drive me from the house entirely and claim complete victory in our psychological war. But something rebellious in me refused to surrender. Maybe it was exhaustion from years of strategic retreats, or maybe it was the sudden clarity that running away would only confirm everything he'd been saying about my character. Either way, I found myself shaking my head. No. The word surprised us both. Mason's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his controlled facade. "Excuse me?"
I said no. I'm not leaving. This is my house too, and I'm not going to let you drive me out of it with threats and manipulation. For a moment, we stood there in the kitchen, staring at each other, the air thick with tension and unspoken threats. I could see Mason recalculating, adjusting his strategy to account for my unexpected defiance. Then his expression shifted, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood turn to ice. It was the look of someone who had just decided that subtle manipulation was no longer sufficient, that more direct methods were required. "You know what, Riley?" he said, his voice taking on a strange, almost cheerful quality. "You're absolutely right. This is your house too, and maybe it's time we settled this like a family." The last thing I saw before the pain exploded through my left arm was Mason's fist coming toward me with the speed and force of a linebacker making a tackle. The last thing I heard before I hit the kitchen floor was the sharp crack of bone breaking under pressure. Then everything went white, and the real nightmare began. Consciousness returned slowly, like surfacing from deep water. The first sensation was pain, a white-hot agony radiating from my left forearm that made everything else fade into background noise. The second was the cold hardness of the kitchen floor against my cheek. The third was Mason's voice, strangely calm and measured, speaking to someone on the phone. Yes, I think she might have broken something. She fell down the basement stairs. "No, I didn't see it happen. I just heard the crash and found her at the bottom. Riley, Riley, can you hear me? The paramedics are on their way." Through the haze of pain and confusion, I tried to process what I was hearing. Basement stairs? I hadn't been anywhere near the basement. I'd been standing in the kitchen when Mason's fist connected with my arm, when the bones snapped like a dry branch. But Mason was weaving a different narrative, one that cast him as the hero of the story while creating a plausible explanation for my injuries that required no external witnesses or contradictory evidence. "I'm going to stay with her until help arrives," and I heard the phone click off. Mason knelt beside me on the kitchen floor, his face a mask of concern that would have been convincing to anyone who didn't know what had really happened. "Hey, Riley, try not to move too much. You took a pretty bad fall." I managed to focus my eyes on his face, seeing the cold satisfaction hidden beneath his performance of worried care. You broke my arm." "Shh, don't try to talk right now. You're confused. You fell down the stairs and hurt yourself. I heard the crash from the kitchen and came running to help you."
The gaslighting was immediate and merciless. Even as I lay there with my arm screaming in pain, Mason was already rewriting history, establishing the official version of events that would be reported to the paramedics, to the hospital, to our parents. I was in the kitchen. "You hit me." "Riley, listen to me carefully." His voice took on a gentle, patronizing tone that I'd heard him use with confused elderly relatives. "You're hurt and disoriented. Sometimes, when people have head injuries, they get confused about what happened. You fell down the stairs. That's why your arm is hurt. I'm the one who called for help." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing steadily louder. Mason stood and moved to the front door, preparing to guide the paramedics to my location. I tried to sit up, but the movement sent fresh waves of agony through my arm and made the room spin sickeningly. "Stay down, Riley. Help is almost here." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of uniforms, medical equipment, and professional voices asking questions I couldn't answer coherently. The paramedics, a middle-aged woman named Janet and a younger man called Torres, worked with practiced efficiency, checking my pupils, taking my blood pressure, and carefully examining my obviously broken arm. "What's your name, honey?" Janet asked, shining a small flashlight in my eyes. "Riley Henderson." "Good. Do you remember what happened?" I opened my mouth to tell her about Mason's attack, but he was standing right behind the paramedics, watching me with those cold, calculating eyes. If I contradicted his story now, it would be my word against his, the confused, injured girl versus the calm, reliable witness who'd called for help. I fell down the stairs. "The basement stairs," Mason added helpfully. "I heard the crash from the kitchen. She must have tripped over some of the equipment I have stored down there." Janet nodded, making notes on her clipboard. "Head injuries can cause confusion and memory problems. It's normal not to remember the details clearly." They loaded me on a stretcher with professional gentleness, strapping my injured arm against my body to prevent further damage during transport. Mason rode in the ambulance, playing the role of concerned family member with Oscar-worthy performance. "Her parents are out of town," he explained to the paramedics, "but I've already called them. They're driving back from Boston and Hartford, respectively. They should be at the hospital in a few hours." The emergency room at Westfield General was a sterile maze of bright lights and antiseptic smells. They wheeled me into a treatment bay where a tired-looking resident named Dr. Patel began a more thorough examination. Mason sat in a chair beside the bed, scrolling through his phone with the casual air of someone waiting for a routine appointment. "We're going to need to get some x-rays," Dr. Patel announced after manipulating my arm in ways that made me gasp with pain. "This is definitely broken, probably in 2 places. Can you tell me again how this happened?"
Before I could answer, Mason spoke up. "She fell down the basement stairs. There's a lot of equipment and boxes down there that she probably tripped over. I've been telling Mom and Dad that the area needs to be better organized." Dr. Patel nodded absently, making notes in what I assumed was my medical chart. Basement stairs can be dangerous, especially if they're cluttered. We see injuries like this fairly regularly. The X-ray technician wheeled me to the radiology department where they positioned my arm on cold metal plates and disappeared behind lead shields while the machine hummed and clicked. Through the observation window, I could see Mason standing in the hallway, typing rapidly on his phone, probably crafting the perfect messages to our parents, establishing his version of events before they arrived. The X-rays confirmed what everyone already knew. My left radius was fractured in 2 places, requiring immediate setting and casting. Dr. Patel explained the procedure while a nurse prepared sedation medications, but I was having trouble focusing on his words. The shock of Mason's attack, combined with whatever pain medication they'd given me, had left me feeling disconnected from my own body. "Are there any questions before we proceed?" Dr. Patel asked. I wanted to ask so many things. I wanted to ask why no one was questioning the suspicious circumstances of my fall. I wanted to ask why my stepbrother seemed so calm and collected while I lay there in agony. I wanted to ask how Mason could sit there weaving lies with such practiced ease while medical professionals accepted his story without question. Instead,
I just shook my head and let them wheel me into the procedure room. The next hour passed in a medicated haze. I was dimly aware of doctors manipulating my broken bone back into alignment, of the warm sensation of casting material being wrapped around my arm, of nurses checking my vital signs and adjusting IV drips. Through it all, Mason remained nearby, answering questions about my medical history and family contact information with the authority of someone genuinely concerned about my welfare. I drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversations between medical staff. Someone mentioned that the fracture pattern was consistent with a fall onto an outstretched arm. Someone else noted that there were no other significant injuries, which suggested I'd been lucky to avoid more serious trauma. No one questioned whether the official story made medical sense or whether there might be other explanations for my injuries. When I finally came fully awake, my arm was encased in a bright blue cast from wrist to elbow, and Patricia was sitting beside my bed with tears streaming down her face. Dad stood behind her, his expression a mixture of concern and the kind of frustrated helplessness that men often display in medical settings. "Oh, honey," Patricia said, reaching out to touch my uninjured hand. "When Mason called, I can't believe this happened. We should have cleaned out that basement months ago." Mason stood near the window, looking appropriately subdued and guilty. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I kept meaning to organize my equipment better. If I hadn't left those boxes in the walkway, Riley never would have tripped." The performance was flawless. He'd positioned himself as partially responsible for creating the hazardous conditions, which made him seem honest and self-reflective, while reinforcing the official narrative of my accident. Even his body language conveyed the right mixture of guilt and concern. Slumped shoulders, worried expression, the occasional anxious glance in my direction. "It's not your fault, Mason," Dad said firmly. "Accidents happen. The important thing is that you were there to help and called for medical attention immediately." Still, I feel terrible about it. Maybe if I'd been in the basement when she fell, I could have prevented it somehow. Patricia reached over and squeezed Mason's hand. "You did exactly the right thing. Riley is going to be fine, and that's what matters." I lay there listening to this exchange, marveling at how completely Mason had manipulated the situation. Not only had he avoided responsibility for deliberately breaking my arm, but he'd actually gained sympathy and praise for his handling of the crisis. My parents were grateful to him, viewing him as the responsible family member who'd protected me from even worse injury. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Patricia asked, turning her attention back to me. The question was loaded with implications I wasn't sure how to navigate. How was I feeling? Physically, I was in considerable pain despite the medication. Emotionally, I was reeling from the systematic betrayal by everyone I should have been able to trust. Psychologically, I was questioning my own sanity in the face of such comprehensive gaslighting. "My arm hurts," I said finally, which was the only safe truth I could offer. "The doctor said the fracture should heal completely with proper care," Dad said. "You'll need to wear the cast for about 6 weeks and then physical therapy to regain full strength and mobility." 6 weeks of carrying around visible evidence of Mason's violence while everyone believed it was the result of my own clumsiness. 6 weeks of being reminded every time I looked at my arm that my family would rather believe a comfortable lie than an inconvenient truth. "The important thing is that you rest and follow the doctor's instructions," Patricia continued. "Mason has already volunteered to help you with anything you need, carrying books, taking notes in class, whatever accommodations are necessary." I looked at Mason, who nodded with appropriate solemnity. "Whatever you need, sis. I feel responsible for what happened, so I want to make sure you have all the support you need to recover." The offer of help was actually a threat. Thinly veiled, but unmistakable. Mason was positioning himself as my caretaker, which would give him unprecedented access to monitor and control my daily activities. He'd be able to ensure that I didn't contradict his version of events, and any attempt to resist his help
would be seen as ungrateful or irrational behavior. "I think I just want to go home and sleep," I said. "Of course," Patricia said, already gathering her purse and jacket. "Mason can help you get settled while I pick up your prescription medications." Dr. Patel appeared with discharge paperwork and a list of follow-up instructions. He explained the signs of complications to watch for, the importance of keeping the cast dry, and the schedule of checkup appointments. Mason listened attentively and asked thoughtful questions about pain management and activity restrictions, playing the role of responsible family member with characteristic thoroughness. The ride home was a surreal experience. I sat in the passenger seat of Dad's BMW with my cast propped on a pillow, watching familiar neighborhoods pass by while my family discussed the logistics of my recovery as if I weren't there. Patricia worried about how I'd manage at school with a broken arm. Dad wondered whether we should inform my teachers about accommodations I might need. Mason offered to adjust his schedule to provide transportation and assistance with daily tasks.
No one asked how I felt about any of these arrangements. No one questioned whether Mason's version of events made sense. No one seemed to notice that the person who'd allegedly fallen down basement stairs was remarkably calm about the entire experience. When we arrived home, Mason helped me out of the car with gentle solicitousness, supporting my uninjured arm and asking repeatedly whether I felt dizzy or nauseous. His performance of caring concern was so convincing that I almost believed it myself, despite knowing exactly what he'd done to me just hours earlier. The house looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. The kitchen, where Mason had broken my arm, seemed like a crime scene that had been sanitized and returned to normal use. The basement stairs he'd claimed I'd fallen down stood as innocent wood and metal, bearing no evidence of the fictional accident they'd supposedly hosted. "Let's get you upstairs and settled," Patricia said, hovering anxiously as I navigated the steps with my unwieldy cast. Mason followed close behind, ready to catch me if I stumbled, a gesture that would have seemed protective to outside observers, but felt like a reminder of his power to hurt me whenever he chose. My bedroom had been prepared for an invalid's return. Someone had moved a small table next to my bed, stocked with water bottles, pain medication, and a notepad for writing with my uninjured hand. Extra pillows had been arranged to support my cast while sleeping. A basket of magazines and books sat on my dresser, entertainment for the long recovery ahead. "Mason thought of most of these details," Patricia said proudly. "He's been so worried about making sure you have everything you need." I looked at the carefully arranged supplies, recognizing them as props in Mason's ongoing performance. Each thoughtful detail would be remembered and praised, reinforcing his image as the devoted stepbrother who'd gone above and beyond to care for his injured sister. "Thank you," I said, because refusing his kindness would only make me look petulant and ungrateful. Mason smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "Just focus on getting better, Riley. I'll take care of everything else." As my parents fussed over my comfort and discussed dinner arrangements, I lay back against the pillows and stared at my blue cast. Somewhere beneath the fiberglass and padding were the X-rays that told the true story of what had happened. Bone fractures that resulted from deliberate violence, not accidental falls. But the X-rays were just medical evidence, meaningless without someone willing to interpret them correctly. And everyone who mattered had already decided that Mason was the hero of this story, and I was just the clumsy victim who'd brought disaster on herself through carelessness and poor judgment. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine a world where truth mattered more than appearances, where evidence could speak louder than carefully constructed lies. But that world felt as distant and unreachable as the moon, separated from my reality by an insurmountable gulf of willful blindness and misplaced trust. The worst part wasn't the pain in my arm or the inconvenience of the cast. The worst part was the growing certainty that this was just the beginning, that Mason had discovered how far he could push without consequences, and that my broken bone was merely the first installment in a much larger campaign of destruction. As I drifted off to sleep that night, medicated and exhausted, I had no idea that the real battle was about to begin,
or that my salvation would come from the very piece of evidence that everyone had already dismissed as routine medical documentation. The X-ray that would change everything was sitting in a computer file at Westfield General Hospital, waiting for someone with the right eyes to see what it really revealed. The first week of recovery passed in a haze of prescription painkillers and enforced helplessness. Mason had appointed himself my personal caretaker with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed having complete control over another person's daily existence. He carried my books at school, cut my food at dinner, and positioned himself as the devoted stepbrother who was sacrificing his own convenience to ensure my comfort. The performance was so convincing that teachers began praising his dedication during class. Mrs. Rodriguez commended his family values when he asked for extra handouts to help me keep up with assignments. Coach Williams mentioned to other faculty members how impressed he was that Mason had rearranged his workout schedule to accommodate my transportation needs. Even Mrs. Chen, who had previously seemed to see through superficial facades, commented on how wonderful it was to have such a caring sibling. What they didn't see was how Mason used his caretaker role to monitor and control every aspect of my life. He insisted on driving me to and from school, claiming that riding the bus would be too difficult with my cast. This gave him complete control over my schedule and eliminated any opportunity for unsupervised conversations with teachers or classmates who might ask uncomfortable questions about my injury. At home, he hovered constantly, always ready to offer assistance that came with subtle reminders of his power over me. When I struggled to open a jar of peanut butter with one hand, he'd appear with helpful concern, opening it easily while commenting on how dependent I'd become. When I dropped my textbook trying to navigate the stairs, he'd retrieve it with a patient smile and suggest that maybe I should be more careful until my coordination improved. The worst part was how grateful Patricia and Dad were for his constant attention. They saw his behavior as evidence of his maturity and family loyalty, praising him regularly for stepping up during a difficult time. Every compliment they gave him felt like another nail in the coffin of my credibility, another reinforcement of the narrative that painted him as the responsible son and me as the problematic burden who'd brought disaster on herself through carelessness and poor judgment. My isolation became nearly complete. The few acquaintances I had at school seemed uncomfortable around my injury, unsure how to navigate conversations with someone who'd had such a dramatic accident. Mason's constant presence made it impossible to develop any relationships that might have provided emotional support or alternative perspectives on my situation. The physical therapy appointments began during my second week of recovery. Dr. Martinez, the therapist assigned to my case, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who specialized in helping patients regain mobility after traumatic injuries. She worked in a bright, modern facility across town that smelled of disinfectant and determination.
"The good news is that your bones are healing well," she said during my first session, manipulating my fingers and wrists to assess range of motion. "The X-rays show clean breaks that should mend completely with proper rehabilitation." I nodded absently, more focused on the strange sensation of having my arm moved by someone else than on her clinical assessment. The cast would come off in another month, but the physical therapy would continue for several weeks beyond that to restore full strength and flexibility. "Can I ask how this happened?" Dr. Martinez inquired as she guided my arm through a series of gentle exercises. "The injury pattern is a bit unusual for a simple fall." The question caught me off guard. For 3 weeks, everyone had accepted Mason's story without question, treating my basement accident as an unfortunate but unremarkable mishap. Dr. Martinez was the first medical professional to suggest that something about my injury didn't fit the standard narrative. "I fell down the basement stairs," I said automatically, reciting the official version with practiced ease. Dr. Martinez nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. "Basement falls usually result in different fracture patterns. Your breaks are very clean, very localized, almost like something struck your arm directly rather than your body impacting multiple surfaces during a tumbling fall." Mason,
who'd been sitting quietly in the corner reading a magazine, looked up with apparent interest. The stairs in our basement are pretty steep, and there's a metal handrail. Maybe she hit that on the way down. Possibly, Dr. Martinez said, but her tone remained thoughtful. Metal impacts can create clean breaks like this, though usually we'd see some bruising or abrasions from contact with the railing. I looked down at my arm and realizing that she was right. Apart from the fractures themselves, I had no other injuries that would be consistent with falling down a flight of stairs. No scraped knees, no bruised shoulders, no cuts from hitting sharp edges during a tumbling descent. Just 2 clean breaks in my radius bone, exactly where Mason's fist had connected with devastating force. Mason, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner reading a magazine, looked up with apparent interest. The stairs in our basement are pretty steep, and there's a metal handrail. Maybe she hit that on the way down. Possibly, Dr. Martinez said, but her tone remained thoughtful. Metal impacts can create clean breaks like this, though usually we'd see some bruising or abrasions from contact with the railing. Dr. Martinez made some notes in my file, but I could see her glancing at my arm with professional curiosity. Well, regardless of how it happened, we'll have you back to full strength in no time. These exercises should help prevent stiffness and maintain circulation while the bone continues to heal. The session continued with a series of finger movements and gentle stretches designed to keep my hand and wrist functional despite the immobilizing cast. Dr. Martinez was patient and encouraging, but I could sense her continued puzzlement about the nature of my injury. Her questions had planted a seed of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone with medical expertise might recognize that Mason's story didn't add up. That hope grew stronger during my second appointment the following week. Dr. Martinez spent more time examining my x-rays, comparing them to textbook examples of various fracture types. She asked detailed questions about the exact circumstances of my fall, the position I'd landed in, and the immediate sensations I'd experienced. Most basement stair accidents result in what we call compression fractures, she explained, pointing to illustrated examples in a medical textbook. The victim typically lands on their feet or buttocks, and the impact travels up through the bones. Your fractures are different. They're perpendicular stress breaks, the kind we usually see from direct lateral force. Mason, who maintained his helpful demeanor, offering additional details about the basement layout and suggesting various scenarios that might explain the unusual injury pattern. But I noticed that his answers were becoming more elaborate, more defensive, as if he was working harder to maintain the credibility of his story. The important thing is that Riley gets proper treatment, he said, when Dr. Martinez continued to probe for details. We're just grateful the injury wasn't worse. Of course, Dr. Martinez agreed, but she made more notes in my file and spent extra time photographing my cast from various angles for what she called documentation purposes. The third appointment brought an unexpected development. Dr. Martinez had scheduled an additional x-ray to monitor my healing progress, and she asked me to wait in the examination room while she reviewed the images with the facility's radiologist. Mason had stepped out to take a phone call from Stephanie, leaving me alone for the first time in weeks. The freedom felt strange and disorienting, like being released from invisible chains I'd grown accustomed to wearing. I sat on the examination table, swinging my legs nervously, and trying to process the significance of Dr. Martinez's growing suspicions about my injury. When she returned 20 minutes later, her expression was serious and thoughtful. She closed the door behind her and pulled up a chair next to the examination table, positioning herself at eye level with me in a way that suggested an important conversation was about to occur. Riley, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anything about your injury that you haven't told me? Anything about how it really happened? The directness of her question left me speechless. For weeks, I'd been surrounded by people who accepted Mason's lies without question,
who treated my version of events as confused ramblings from a traumatized patient. Now, suddenly, a medical professional was suggesting that there might be more to the story. I fell down the stairs, like I told you before. Dr. Martinez studied my face carefully. Riley, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen hundreds of fractures from falls, accidents, sports injuries, and other causes. Your injury pattern is not consistent with a basement stair fall. It's much more consistent with a direct blow to the arm from something like a baseball bat or a very forceful punch. The words hung in the air between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross. Dr. Martinez was offering me something I desperately wanted for weeks: validation that my experience was real, that the evidence contradicted Mason's carefully constructed lie. But accepting her offer meant admitting truths that could destroy my family and put me in even more danger. Sometimes people are afraid to tell the truth about how they got hurt, especially when the person who hurt them is someone they live with, someone who has power over them. If that's what happened to you, there are people who can help. I looked towards the door, knowing that Mason was somewhere in the building, probably finishing his phone call and preparing to resume his watchful supervision. In a few minutes, he'd be back in this room, monitoring my responses and ensuring that I didn't say anything that contradicted the official narrative.
My stepbrother didn't hurt me, I said quietly, hating myself for the lie, but unable to summon the courage for the truth. Dr. Martinez nodded with obvious disappointment, but no judgment. Okay. But Riley, if you ever want to talk about what really happened, or if you ever feel unsafe at home, I want you to know that you can call me. Anytime, day or night. She handed me a business card with her contact information, along with a small pamphlet about domestic violence resources. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. She believed that I was being abused, and she was offering me a lifeline if I ever became ready to accept help. I want you to keep these somewhere safe, she said. And remember that having someone hurt you is never your fault, no matter what they might tell you or what other people might believe. Mason chose that moment to return, knocking politely on the door before entering with his characteristic blend of concern and authority. How did everything go? Is the healing progressing well? Very well, Dr. Martinez replied smoothly, slipping back into professional mode. Riley's making excellent progress. We should be able to remove the cast on schedule. But I caught the meaningful look she gave me as Mason helped me down from the examination table. It was a look that said she saw through his performance, that she recognized the power dynamic at play, and that she would be watching for signs of escalation. The drive home was tense, though Mason maintained his usual cheerful demeanor. He chatted about school assignments and weekend plans, but I could sense his increased alertness, his careful monitoring of my responses and mood. Dr. Martinez's questions had rattled him, even if he was too skilled to show it overtly. She seemed to ask a lot of questions about your accident, he commented casually as we pulled into our driveway. Usually physical therapists just focus on rehabilitation, not the cause of the injury. She said she wanted to understand the fracture pattern to design better exercises. Makes sense. Mason parked the car and came around to help me out, his hands gentle but possessive as he guided me toward the house. Sometimes medical people can get the wrong idea about things, start seeing problems that aren't really there. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Mason was warning me that Dr. Martinez's suspicions were dangerous, that any attempt to confirm her theories would have serious consequences. He was reminding me that he still held all the power in our relationship, and that challenging his authority would only lead to more pain. That night, lying in bed with Dr. Martinez's business card hidden beneath my mattress, I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what it would be like to tell someone the truth about what had happened. The fantasy was intoxicating. Having an adult believe me, having official support for my version of events, finally being able to stop pretending that Mason was anything other than a violent bully. But the fantasy also terrified me.
What would happen if I accused Mason of deliberately breaking my arm? Would anyone believe a teenage girl with a history of behavioral problems over a star athlete with a spotless reputation? Would Patricia and Dad support me, or would they close ranks around their golden boy and find ways to discredit my accusations? Most frightening of all, what would Mason do if he discovered that I'd betrayed him? If he was willing to break my arm for refusing to leave the house, what punishment would he devise for actively working against him? These questions swirled through my mind as I listened to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. Somewhere down the hall, Mason was probably planning his next move, calculating how to maintain control over a situation that was becoming increasingly unstable. What neither of us knew was that Dr. Martinez had already begun her own investigation, quietly reaching out to colleagues and consulting with experts about suspicious injury patterns in adolescent patients. The x-rays that would ultimately expose Mason's lies were sitting in a computer database, waiting for the right combination of expertise and suspicion to unlock their secrets. And Dr. Martinez, with her 15 years of experience and her growing certainty that something wasn't right about my case, was exactly the person to make that discovery. The truth was about to surface, whether Mason was prepared for it or not. Spring brought Mason's college acceptance to State University on a full football scholarship. Patricia treated him like royalty, while my own college applications gathered dust, half-finished and uninspiring. Every dinner conversation revolved around his achievements, while I became increasingly invisible. "Riley really needs to apply herself more," Patricia told Dad one evening while I washed dishes. "I don't understand how two children from the same household can have such different motivation levels." "Mason was never a late bloomer," she continued. "Even after his father died, he maintained his focus and drive. Meanwhile, I seemed to use any excuse to avoid responsibility." What they didn't understand was that constant psychological warfare was exhausting. Living in perpetual alertness, never knowing when Mason's next manipulation would strike, had drained me of the energy needed for academic excellence. Mason had commandeered the basement for his video editing equipment, trapping my pottery wheel behind his elaborate setup of professional lighting and multiple computer monitors. When I asked to use it, he'd suggest I schedule time around his projects. "I'm working on something really important for my recruitment video," he explained with practiced sincerity that made adults trust him implicitly. "Maybe you could do your art stuff on weekends when I'm not so busy." Patricia nodded approvingly at this reasonable compromise, but the weekends never worked out. Mason always had urgent projects, deadlines, reasons why I couldn't access my own equipment. My pottery pieces sat half-finished, gathering dust, tangible reminders of how effectively he controlled my life through seemingly reasonable restrictions. Mason's girlfriend Stephanie started spending more time at our house. She was everything I wasn't: confident, popular, effortlessly beautiful. Patricia adored her, treating her with maternal warmth she'd never shown me. "Stephanie is such a lovely girl," Patricia would gush. "So poised and well-mannered. She's going to study pre-med at State. Such an ambitious young woman." Stephanie was polite to me in the way popular girls are polite to younger, awkward relatives, with distant kindness that never quite reached her eyes. Her presence amplified everything wrong with our family dynamic. When she visited, Patricia became even more effusive in praising Mason, even more pointed in criticizing me. Dad would emerge from his usual distraction to play the successful stepfather role.
I became the family's dirty secret, the problem child they minimized when company was over. During Stephanie's visits, I was encouraged to stay in my room or find activities elsewhere. The message was clear. I was an embarrassment, a disruption to their perfect family image. The breaking point came on a Thursday in March. I had stayed after school working on my art portfolio with Mrs. Chen, preparing for a regional competition. She praised my latest piece, a lone figure standing at a cliff's edge beneath storm clouds. "This shows real artistic maturity," she said, studying the emotional isolation I depicted. "There's such raw emotion here. It speaks to a very specific kind of loneliness." The figure's posture conveyed being trapped between safety and the unknown vastness beyond the cliff's edge. It was exactly how I felt in the Henderson house, perpetually on the verge of falling, with no safe place to land. You should enter this competition, Mrs. Chen continued. These pieces show emotional depth. You have something important to say. For the first time in months, I felt genuine hope. Maybe there was something I could excel at, an identity beyond being Mason's problematic stepsister. The art competition could prove I had value, that I could contribute something meaningful. Walking home with my portfolio case, it felt lighter than it had in weeks. The house was dark when I arrived, only Mason's Jeep in the driveway. Patricia was at the book club, Dad was still at work. I headed upstairs to scan my portfolio pieces when I heard movement from my parents' bedroom. Through the slightly open door, I saw Mason at Patricia's jewelry box, examining something small and glittering before slipping it into his pocket. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The golden boy was stealing from Patricia, who treated him like her biological son. Finally, I had concrete evidence of his true nature. But as I reached for my phone, reality hit. Mason would hear the camera, explain it away, turn it around so I became the problem. He always had explanations that made him look caring while making me appear vindictive. I retreated to my room, heart pounding with excitement and fear. The pendant looked like Patricia's diamond heirloom, from her grandmother, valuable both sentimentally and monetarily. If I could prove Mason had stolen it, even Patricia's maternal blindness would have to acknowledge his true nature. But as evening wore on and family life resumed, Patricia returning from book club, Dad from work, cheerful dinner conversation downstairs, I began doubting my plan. Who would believe me? I'd been crying wolf about Mason's behavior for 3 years, building a reputation as a difficult teenager who made up stories about her innocent stepbrother. Even if I could prove the theft, Mason would find explanations. Maybe he was cleaning the jewelry as a surprise. Maybe borrowing it for some romantic gesture with Stephanie. Maybe taking it for repairs. He always had reasons that made him look thoughtful while making me look suspicious. The next morning, I watched Patricia prepare for work, waiting to see if she noticed the missing pendant. She stood at her jewelry box selecting earrings and a bracelet, but showed no distress or confusion. Either the pendant wasn't important or she hadn't noticed its absence. At breakfast, Mason was charming as always, asking Dad about business trips, complimenting Patricia's outfit. When our eyes met, his knowing smile chilled my blood. He knew I'd seen him and wasn't worried in the slightest. That's when I understood how completely he'd outmaneuvered me. Even with evidence of criminal behavior, I was powerless. He'd spent 3 years systematically destroying my credibility, painting me as unstable and dishonest, creating a narrative where any accusation would be dismissed as fantasy. He'd turned my own family into accomplices, convinced them I was the problem, the liar, the one who couldn't be trusted. Watching him butter his toast with perfect composure while stolen jewelry sat in his pocket, I understood he'd been building towards something much bigger than petty theft. Mason wasn't just stealing Patricia's pendant, he was stealing my entire life, piece by piece, and no one would believe me when the final blow came. The art competition deadline passed that night while I sat paralyzed, knowing even this small triumph had been overshadowed by Mason's crime. I never submitted my portfolio, never told Mrs. Chen why I'd changed my mind. I waited in the dark for whatever Mason planned next, knowing I'd face it completely alone. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.